Corinna. Louise Carazana. Christine Jacobs. Sarah Pennington.
Present.
Bill Palmer. David Lacy. Juwan Lee. Taylor Jenkins. David Cook. Tiffany Dubinsky.
Here.
Michael Barnes. Tony Choi. Richard Duran. Donna Chin.
She's on here.
I just want to open by noting there's another fatal crash in the MPO area on Thursday. Just want to remember that the work we do here is important and affects people's lives. So with that in mind, let's continue on. We'll start with matters from the public. Do we have any members of the public who like to speak here?
I know it's important that the remote folks be able to hear. Is this an appropriate spot to say? Can you hear me, remote folks?
Can everybody hear Peter online?
Sorry, I brought it up.
Donna, I muted for a second. I think that was a good response.
Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
Thank you. My name is Peter Krebs. I'm from the Piedmont Environmental Council. We have a 9-county service area covering really the 29 and 15 corridors from Loudoun County to Albemarle County. I work mainly here in Charlottesville and Albemarle. I'd like to speak for just a second about smart scale. We've been concerned for more than a year about the direction that smart scale might be heading. And what I read in the packet last night confirms some of our concerns. Broadly speaking, there are two areas of concern that I would simply be interested to have the MPO here and be working on it in whatever way it can. Number one is the decrease in funding or decrease in projects for bicycle, pedestrian, and transit projects. This seems like exactly the wrong direction for the Commonwealth to be moving, especially in this moment. It seems like every indicator you can think of suggests that we should be doing more projects, not fewer, to promote bicycling, walking, and transit. Secondly, and this is the one that we saw coming for a long time, is the de-emphasis of land use as a factor, or even the elimination of land use planning as a factor. I think we really need to be clear that reducing congestion or increasing the velocity of vehicles is absolutely a land use decision. Unfortunately, it's a regressive land use decision. And we think it's important for localities and MPOs to be able to take into consideration their own growth goals, rather than assuming growth and sprawl are good things. That might have been an appropriate modality in the, we'll say, 50 years ago, the mid-20th century. But that's not the way that at least Charlottesville and Albemarle seem to be thinking with their comprehensive plans. So simply, I would be interested to hear MPO thoughts on A, whether this needs to be the way it is, or B, if smart scale stops being an appropriate way to encourage more sustainable transportation, what other vehicles might be possible, or what avenues might be pursued to get this work done. Simply building more roads is not going to help things, and that's sort of what the new methodology seems to be encouraging. Thank you very much.
All right, do we have any other members of the public who would like to speak? I guess we'll have to skip the general administration topics if they require a vote. We want to move on to moving toward 2050, or do we want to start with smart scale and hope that we get a full quorum for that?
We don't necessarily need a quorum, but if you want to wait, it probably is helpful to have more people part of that discussion if possible. So if you want to go ahead and start with smart scale, we can do that.
Okay, let's do that.
Let me find my place in the PowerPoint side. Oh, there you go.
There's a point.
You still want to go with smart scale?
Let's go with the longer.
Long range transportation plan. Okay. Let me pull up the right. Okay. So before I start, this is really going to be a bulk of our discussion this morning is talking about the thresholds that we want to use for the evaluation of the long range transportation plan. But before we get started, I just wanted to give you all a brief update on where we are with our public engagement. I forgot the metrics I shared with you last time, but at this point, we have had contacts or some sort of response or opportunity to receive comments with over 500 individuals at this point. So we had the stakeholder discussion groups back in February. We did our open house and our virtual meeting. We have 313 responses from our MetroQuest survey this morning, which also includes over 1,100 map comments of people who are either identifying opportunities for improvements or system needs. To date, we've had our staff has been present at 9 different public engagement intercepts. So that includes outreach at the transit center, working with CRHA. We're in the process of attending all of the community advisory committee meetings. We attended, or we worked, did some outreach at the center at Belvedere, and we attended both national night out events for both Albemarle and Charlottesville. And so through those discussions, we've had personal discussions with nearly 160 community members. So our goal for the public engagement for the entire process was probably about 0.5% of the MPO population area. That's just under 700 people. So this is just the first phase. There will be another phase of public engagement once we start identifying the project priorities. So I think, I'm pretty pleased with where we are. I think we're making a pretty concentrated effort to make sure that we are reaching out to more vulnerable users as part of how we're targeting our in-person engagement, but just wanted to share that update with you all at this point. We're hoping to close the survey. Well, we will be closing the survey at the end of August. That doesn't mean that there won't be other opportunities for public engagement. It just means that at that point, we need to start using the feedback that we've received in terms of evaluating the system needs. So any questions on that before we get into the more technical discussion? No. Okay. All right, so you all may recall that we worked with the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment. We received what's called a Growth and Accessibility Planning Grant through them. And that helped us develop this process for developing a prioritization process, both to prioritize our system needs and then also to prioritize our system projects. So just to take you back a little bit to last fall when we were discussing this in more depth, the general process is that we're looking first at identifying where the highest priority system needs are based on our established priorities. And from there, we're going to use that to identify what are the projects that seem to meet our highest priority system needs. And that will help us start developing our list of candidate projects for consideration on our constrained or high priority list. And then once we narrow that list down a little bit, then we'll start working through the prioritization of projects themselves. And so those projects are projects that have been identified through other planning initiatives or efforts. So things like comprehensive plans, things like the VDOT pipeline studies, things like small area studies that are conducted either through a county initiative or maybe another planning initiative like with the TJPDC's bike ped plan, something like that. The other thing that this is going to help us do is when we identify the needs, we're also going to see where there may be a really high priority need that doesn't have a project matched against it. And so that's going to help us identify where our priority planning efforts need to go. So that's the general process that we're talking about. I know it's been a little while since we talked about this. What I want to emphasize is that we were having conversations about this in the fall. So all of that feedback that we discussed that you all gave me when we were talking about that in the fall was communicated back to the consultants as part of this process and has been considered in terms of developing this prioritization and the measures that we're going to use. This is focusing on on the data that we're going to use to assess the system. So I also want you all to keep in mind that we're going to have this assessment of the system based on the data performance that we're receiving, what can be measured with the data. But then we're also asking for feedback from the public right now as part of this engagement on where they see a need for improvements, where they're having problems. And so those are both going to be incorporated when we identify where the high priority needs are. Any questions on general process? Okay. All right. So again, just to sort of help set us in context, what we're going to do is we're going to be establishing performance measures within each of our needs categories. And then we're going to go through a process that's kind of similar to SMART scale, whereas each need is given a raw score. We use a raw score to kind of help us assess how an area, what the needs are, and then that's going to be standardized to a 7-point scale, and then those are all going to be standardized together. So this is a way for us to take different kinds of metrics that are being evaluated in different units of measurement and put them together to help us figure out when they're stacked together based on how much we decide as a region we want to prioritize each of those different goals or objectives or measures. That helps us find the areas where there's the highest combined need across all categories. We're going to go through all of this in detail, but this just shows where the performance measures, what metrics have been developed for each of the like goal categories, or what the performance measures are that we're going to use in each of the goal categories. So a couple things that I want to emphasize, to the extent possible, we considered multimodal transportation or multimodal transit system operations. So for safety, for example, there's a roadway safety and a pedestrian safety category. So we wanted to make sure we are capturing the mode discussions. And then we also wanted to, when possible, also consider the equity impacts. And that goes into that overall framework that we were establishing in terms of using that equity frame or that equity lens in evaluating these. Some of the equity considerations are going to be more explicit, like there's a performance measure related to accessing jobs by disadvantaged populations. And some of these are going to be more implicit, meaning that, for example, pedestrian safety, one of the factors that is considered using the measure that we're using for determining the pedestrian safety priorities already factors in vulnerable road users. So just want to also mention that because it's going to be more apparent in some places than others that the equity was considered. So we're going to go through each of these, and we pretty much have the majority of the time today to talk about these. We don't have to use the full time though, but really what has occurred is that for each of these performance measures, the consultants developed 2 different thresholds that we could use to determine how we want to start prioritizing the needs. So the thresholds are going to use, basically, I think the way that this makes sense in my mind is they're going to say, what is the universe of potential needs that we want to start considering for a score? So if a project or a need or a location falls outside of that threshold in that potential category, they're not going to get scored at all. They're not going to show up as a need when we do the analysis. So really, we're just trying to start by saying, what do we think qualifies as a need to even be evaluated and considered for each of the performance measures? Does that make sense? We can talk about that more too as we go through. All right, so we'll start with something that's fairly straightforward. The first thing that we need to make sure we're capturing is where are there safety improvements. And so what we are doing is basically we're going to select a threshold for which of the potential for safety improvement thresholds we want to use. And again, that's going to determine which projects or which locations are considered as a need for the purpose of moving forward to the score. The potential for safety improvement just defines which locations we're going to consider. What's actually going to give those projects a score is basically doing this equivalent property damage only crash frequency analysis. So basically you multiply the number of crashes times the equivalent property damage only weighted value, and those with the highest EPDO or equivalent property damage only values are going to be the highest priority projects. This is using smart scale values for EPDO. So I know there's some question about whether or not these are the right values to use, but this does give us some opportunity to align at least this particular score with the way that smart scale evaluates their safety priorities, but we can also use different, we can change the values if you all have feedback on what you would prefer to use instead. So the two thresholds that were suggested by the consultants in developing this grant is that we can either just use all PSI intersections and PSI segments with 3 or more crashes in a 5-year analysis period. So that's basically anything where there is, I don't know, Michael, if you have any feedback on how PSI is determined, but it's basically using sort of a predictive model to determine how many crashes they would expect to be at an intersection or on a segment. And so PSI is determined by areas where there are more than what is expected. So there's an opportunity for potential for safety improvement at those areas. So the recommendation is that we can either start with considering every segment or intersection where there's a potential for a safety improvement within our MPO area, or we could limit that to the top 10 miles of segments and top 20 intersections within the boundaries. So the implications would be that if we're going with the first threshold, any area, any location where there's an opportunity for safety, for a safety improvement would be evaluated and given a score, versus the second threshold, which would just prioritize the most severe locations or areas. So any thoughts or comments or feedback on that at this point?
The first one is all locations. I mean, that gives us some flexibility.
3 or more.
Yeah.
So there are more places with 3 or more crashes than the 10 miles of segments and 20 intersections. I would have thought of the 3 or more is, yeah, it would be a 10.
Keep in mind that this also considers not just fatal or serious injury crashes, but all crashes. Yeah.
Any crash, I consider minor injuries.
Right.
It seems probably a pretty good threshold.
Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly the threshold is, but again, it's really crashes where the number of crashes that they see at those locations exceed what's expected.
Oh, so sorry, what I just said probably is inaccurate. Slide before you were showing that it's equivalent. But in addition to the type of crashes, you're also tracking the same crash.
I believe that's how the potential for safety improvement calculations are scored. But basically there's a ranking, and I don't know exactly how many others, but it goes into like the hundreds for the TJPDC region.
I mean, if you use all PSI intersections, PSI segments, if you're with a crash, you're still going to be able to like prioritize the intersections that have, you know, if that indeed tops the 10 miles and 20 intersections, you're still going to be able to prioritize.
Yeah, I can show.
First intersection, first section, yeah, same. It's really highest.
Right. So if you use this top threshold right here, what's going to happen is that these top 10 miles of PSI segments, the ones in this threshold, in the second threshold, will receive a higher score than any of the ones that aren't within that threshold. And I think this shows a map. So this is all PSI segments. So basically the lighter the yellow, or the darker the yellow, the brighter the yellow, I guess I should say, those are the ones that would receive like those higher scores. So basically what would happen, I know these maps are hard to see. Basically what would happen is if we use that first threshold or that second threshold where it's just limiting it to like the top 10 segments and the top 20 intersections, you would see a reduction in some of these. You wouldn't necessarily see these same like segments showing up, but you would see the ones that are already bright yellow would stay bright yellow, and there would just be less of a network of safety locations too, that would be included in the analysis. It sounds like, from what you all are saying though, it sounds like you would like to start at least with all of the intersections where there's an opportunity for a safety improvement. Okay.
I feel like there's a very low priority one side, you know. I don't know, they're not gonna score low.
Yeah.
Project, but that's the reason, because of the safety.
Yeah. Anybody want to push back against that? Okay. Okay. So the next item is looking at
I'm sorry, I have a clarifying question.
oh no worries.
I know it takes us down a rabbit hole, a minute too later, but regardless of which one we use, you'll still be then using the EPBO to average with that score, which is what will bring the severity is.
Yeah, so the ones that are at the top will be at the top regardless of which measure we're using. This just sort of says how many of these projects are even going to be considered to be scored or to receive that EPBO score.
So is there like an administrative benefit to like categorically excluding all the very low ones? Like, is it easier to run the ranking, or is it just easier to consider it all? Or is it just that we?
Yeah, no, I think because the ranking is all going to be processed through like a GIS analysis. So it's not going to be like a manual processing. I think probably from my perspective, it might make sense to start with more safety improvements, you know, from the universe, because even if it doesn't necessarily significantly impact which projects are prioritized through the process, it gives us more opportunities to identify where there are safety concerns in our area, which could have good utility for other initiatives that we're undertaking, and also just help us best align where we have projects ready to queue up that can meet some of these needs. We can always do this and then look back and say, maybe this is too many projects, or maybe these really are capturing a lot of areas where there aren't a lot of significant safety needs, and see if we want to maybe cut it off at some point. Yeah.
Is there a way for this to be more iterative? I mean, not quite understanding how it's going to play out, the process, and go back and revisit some of these decisions later on.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is just sort of giving us a starting point to have the discussion. So we could also start with the thresholds, and I think it's more of like a policy decision. Do we want to focus on the most severe areas and only the most severe areas? Or do we think that there's utility to thinking wherever we can improve safety, that's valuable, and we want to improve safety regardless of whether it's the most significant, if we have the opportunity to do it?
Yeah, I guess my point is,
Yeah.
we get to the, you know, we get partway through this process, we start to understand how the tool works a little better. Results that we're coming out with, I think we can go back and this is just picking different factors, getting this is GIS exercise, so you probably want to both of it once. I mean, realize you can't have too many variables change around the same time, but you give us a choice on variable. We're going to do X, we're going to do Y, and I'm just saying,
Yeah.
well, let's pick Y for now. Your logic makes sense, but interesting what it turns out that's going to be with prior qualitative aspects of this thing.
Yeah.
Maybe go back and look down slightly. You get the data. You can compare it to the data, compare the sets really. If we end up coming back to the highest, then all bodies we're kind of working on already.
Sure, yeah.
Smart scale project work,
Yeah.
then maybe it doesn't make sense to do the highest ones. So some of the ones that are
Right.
smart scale projects, that's
Yep. Yeah, no, I gotcha. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think I want to be conscientious that we're thinking through like what are the priorities without thinking through like what are the specific projects, but I think at some point we have to screen those for what are the actionable projects that we can work on based on what the analysis is spitting out.
Another way to put this, is, I don't know what's wrong with our area, given to us,
Mhm.
because I'm still trying to figure out the forest looks like. We're each tree,
Mhm.
right here, the forest is, which is fine, but
Yeah.
I may come back and questions about.
Sure.
that tree to meet that housing.
Sure. Any other questions or feedback or thoughts? Okay. Well, we'll start with focusing on all of them first, and then if we feel like that's not, if that's capturing maybe a lot of areas that we don't necessarily consider having significant concerns, maybe we revisit that later. All right, so the second measure is talking about the pedestrian safety needs. And what this is using the PSAP, or the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, that was developed by VDOT. And what I found out is that the most recent version 3.0, even though it still calls it a Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, does include bike crashes as well. That was not true for the first versions 1 and 2. So basically the PSAP, it does show crashes, pedestrian and bicycle related crashes, but it goes further than that because relative to overall system safety concerns, there's a relatively low number of bicycle and pedestrian crashes overall. So it also uses a predictive measure to determine where there's a high propensity for people who need to use some of these pedestrian corridors or need to be able to access different areas outside of a single occupancy vehicle. So that consider things like where are there activity generators within the area, what's the population of households without a vehicle, those kinds of things. So there is an equity consideration built in to determining where the highest priority safety pedestrian corridors are. It also considers the design of the transportation system. So things like the design, speed, number of lanes, et cetera. So based on this map, or based on this process, there are a couple of different priorities or levels of priority that are identified through the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. And so if you read through the report that was provided, it mentions the top 1% or the top 5% of corridors and talks about statewide or district. I'm pretty sure that that was a mistake in how they wrote the report, and that really the discussion that we need to consider is whether or not we want to limit the pedestrian priority corridors to the statewide top 1% or the statewide top 5%, because the district top 1% segments are all in both of those, and there's very little in the district top 5%. So
the statewide top 5%, including the local roads, or are they highways like the 1%?
so on this map right here, the top 1% is the red, and then if you're looking at the top 5%, that would include the blue areas. And those are all of these, the red and the blue, are also considered in the district top 1% segment. And there were only a couple of additional like intersections that were included in the district top 5%. So basically we're choosing between, do we want the red network and to focus on pedestrian improvements in the red network, or do we want to use both the red and the blue networks, both the 1% and the 5%, which would include the top 1%. So basically based on that decision, it's, do we want to focus on largely pedestrian needs or pedestrian improvements that would facilitate access along the major thoroughfares and the major road networks, or do we want to also include more of the local road networks and prioritizing the safety improvements for pedestrians? Yeah. I thought this would be a short discussion. Yeah. Okay. All right. And so this shows, this is the top 1% for the district. But I think, like I said, I think this map is incorrect. I think the metrics they're using were incorrect. The multimodal accessibility, this one I'm going to spend a little bit more time explaining because it's a little bit harder to wrap your mind around. Yeah.
If the map is incorrect, is it going to correct it for this analysis?
Yeah, this was just developed as a PowerPoint for reference by the consultant, so we'll pull the data and run the analysis, yeah.
So, one thing, it's not part of the threshold conversation, I guess, but like, with that map, and this kind of scoring of safety needs in general, they're based on the percentage of the length of the segment that has a safety need. Which to me seems a little weird, right? Like if you have, a long road that's largely like has sidewalks is safe, but then there's one extremely unsafe part of it. Effectively, the whole thing becomes unusable for pedestrians because they can't get past that one part, right? And that would score very low here because very little of it, actually has a need. And yet, the whole corridor, really has that need because it's not useful. And I don't know how you would capture that, but it seems like a deficiency in how this is scored.
So you're talking about,
PSAP is.
Well, so it's not the PSAP score itself, it's the this table 7
Percent of total mileage.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, my guess is that any segment that had any sort of bike or head crash, you can consider able to show up here and then you can just cross reference maybe that heat map and I hear that. I agree that maybe a segment might. I think what for timeout scoring, we may want to delve into that because it might drop a segment down a little bit if it's unduly long compared to another segment. Scores lower just because generally that we're going to capture all the areas for this theory.
and there is a heat map on PSAP too. In fact, if you all really want to, we can look at it in a little bit more detail. It always starts with Richmond. How do I zoom out? There you go.
At this point, Sandy,
Yeah.
I'm just kind of recommending an approach. We're not locked into exactly how these things get scored or how.
No, we're gonna. In fact, we're gonna talk about the. We're gonna talk about the actual weighting and things like that at our next meeting. So really, we're just looking at as a general policy, how do we want to prioritize these things to start off with? And again, this is just. I don't want us to get too hung up on the data because the data is a tool, but the data gives us a starting point to have a conversation. And we're going to go back and say, based on the decisions we made about how to analyze this and the data that we thought we wanted to use, does this seem reasonable based on what we know about the system and based on the public feedback that we also received? So this is the Charlottesville area. So just so you can kind of.
Let me look that up. There's something called pathways for planning, the VDOT website, you get a lot of information, GIS-based website, sign up, and get a user, name and password. It's a lot of interesting information to delve into this stuff. Pathways for planning is probably something you guys should check out.
I don't know if that's publicly accessible.
It is.
Is it?
I got it first,
Yeah. No, you can't. You can from us. I don't know if the public can get a sign in for it.
No, I mean,
Okay.
I've heard just sign up using it. I think it's a builder. I'll leave it if it's not. I'm sure we can get those in CTAC to get tax.
But this shows that there are crash cluster locations. It shows the bike ped crash heat map. So I mean, this is what it's showing up right now. It's the heat maps. So this is where there are a need for pedestrian crossings. So,
Need a username.
yeah.
And go ahead, while you're doing that, you do one of the websites, it's not apparent, the contact that button on the top. Doing that, thing, quite active.
But the other thing I want to mention is that for some of these, so this is capturing one set of data, but for some of those things, like where there's a network gap, there are going to be other measurements that we are also capturing those in other ways. So there might be other proxies that are filling some of the gaps that, you know, any one of these measures by themselves may not quite adequately be capturing total. So any other questions on the pedestrian safety? Okay. All right. So what we tried to do was we wanted to really focus on how, or what is the sort of capturing what is the opportunity to improve accessibility for different communities of people based on different travel modes. So working with the consultants, they developed this multimodal accessibility measure, which is using sort of access to jobs as a proxy to say these are areas where you can where there are a lot of opportunities to get out into the community and by these different modes, and these are opportunities where we can make it easier for people to access different parts of the community. So this is measuring access to jobs, which is a little bit different than the land use score, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which is measuring access to community destinations. So this is using jobs sort of as the frame of reference for where are there opportunities to improve access. So I'm going to walk through this a little bit. It's a little bit complicated. You all probably don't need to know this in as much detail as I'm going to go through it, but just for the sake of being able to explain it, I'm going to show you how we are developing what we are referring to as a potential for accessibility improvement. So we have a potential for safety improvement. This is a potential for accessibility improvement. So each of these little blocks right here represents a census block. And the number within the census block is showing the number of jobs that someone could be able to get to from that census block based on whichever mode of travel we are using for this analysis. So this first reference block shows, so there are two different conditions that we're considering. The first is a high stress condition. So in this case, we're talking about bicycle improvements. And then the second condition is a low stress condition. So for all of the jobs that are within a, that are basically listed in this number that are listed within, maybe I think for bicycles, it's like a 10-mile, area. So assuming you can get there within about 15 minutes or so. If you include all of the jobs that would be accessible under really high stressful travel conditions. So there are hills, there are high traffic volumes, maybe there aren't dedicated bike lanes, things like that. Under the high stress travel conditions, a person in this block can get to 98 jobs. And if we only consider the low stress travel conditions and how many jobs are accessible under those very low stress travel conditions, this person could get to 88 jobs. So that difference between 98 and 88 is where the transportation network is potentially limiting the number of jobs that are accessible for someone because of the level of accessibility that it would require to reach those additional jobs. So that is occurring for every single one of these blocks in the census block. So each little square represents a census block, and we are doing this for every single census block at the same time. So the first thing that we do is we subtract the number of jobs you can reach under the low stress travel conditions from the number of jobs you can reach under the high stress travel conditions. And that shows what the potential accessibility improvement is going to be. So the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to multiply that by the population in order to get a population weighted potential for accessibility improvement. And we're going to do this for all of the blocks. And then we're going to add those all up together within the maximum travel distance. And we're going to divide that by the person weighted accessibility for the entire study area. So this is the population. this 10 right here, this is the population within that census block. This is the difference in how many more jobs could be accessible under the high stress travel conditions compared to the low stress travel conditions. We multiplied those together, each block, you know, you're multiplying 80 times 4, 92 times 8, et cetera, throughout this whole area. And then we get this population weighted potential for accessibility improvement. So that's for that whole area. So we do this for each of those blocks and we add it up. This is the total for that whole area. So that's the area that's within that, whatever we define as that travel radius, divided by the population. And we get this number 5.26. So that is our weighted potential for accessibility improvement for that block. So we could think of this as like the MPO area or the travel area. And so 5.26 is the population weighted opportunity to improve accessibility for this area. So then what we want to do is look at what kinds of roads are being served or are going through the census block to determine what types of population density or what kind of travel density we might expect. And so there's this multiplying factor that is defined based on the different type of road type that goes through that block that would potentially provide access. So the idea is that there's a potential for accessibility improvement along a principal or arterial that has an opportunity to improve the travel for a higher number of people, because there's likely to be more of a population that needs to have improved access along that principal arterial compared to maybe a major collector or minor collector. So bigger roads, more people would likely benefit from an accessibility improvement there. For anything that's a limited access facility, we're just using that as a zero. We're saying we don't want bicycles on that. So we're taking them out of the criteria.
How are you using off trails or associated roads?
Those probably wouldn't show up as an accessibility improvement. Those might be a preferred solution to one of the needs that are identified here, though. Trails should, I would assume, trails should show up under the level of travel stress 1, right? That would be a pretty low stress travel condition for most people. So if there's a trail that's operating, those should show up under the reference condition. So again, this is just defining a need. This is not identifying the preferred solution. And so you take that 5.26 score and we're going to multiply it times whatever the roadway type is that is providing the access to those census blocks and multiplying those, and that gives us our raw accessibility need. And then we would standardize those across like all the needs that are identified within the region. I know that you probably have questions and I'm not 100% confident I can answer them, but happy to go back through any of this if you need me to.
So a census block that has many of those different road types like that is going to higher score, which means it already is fairly accessible compared to a block that does not.
Or it has a much higher opportunity for an accessibility improvement if it's not accessible already. Yeah.
What does that look like as a map? But we don't know the data yet.
So each of those little census blocks is going to sort of have a score. And so the other thing you need to, so the places that are being scored or the places that are lit up a little bit brighter, those are places where those areas have a greater need for access to jobs. So it's based on, this is the origin of where people are starting, where there's a limitation in access to jobs.
So broadly speaking, this map and it's small, it's sort of showing the northern, it's probably what it's wanting to do, right? The CAC, the YIC, CAC, even it's not really having much of a non-motorized access need. Is that the right way? But obviously the city is, but it looks like some of those roads that are sort of mercury, like maybe dark road, and this is one is gray. Yes, it's someplace medium or medium high. Is that something that should be interpreted?
I mean, comparatively, again, these maps are just examples, but yeah, comparatively, that's what that would say, is that the areas where there are the highest opportunity for an accessibility improvement. would not be in the Rio area based on this map.
And yet that's a place with a lot of jobs. In that area, the highest population in the county is in that.
Right.
Highest density of counties in that area too.
So keep in mind what we're measuring though is the potential for an accessibility improvement. So what that means is that there might be a lot of jobs there, but there might not be as high of an opportunity for that accessibility improvement in that area. So we're basically doing something similar for all different mode types. We're doing something similar for transit, where we're sort of comparing a reference condition against sort of an idealized condition. So for transit, the idealized condition would be, what if transit was just as efficient as driving in a car? For vehicular movement, we're doing this for vehicles as well. So for automobile access, what is the accessibility improvement if all the time the roadway conditions were what they are like in free flow traffic conditions? And then we're also doing this based on a disadvantaged population. So instead of multiplying this times the general population in each census block, we would focus on the populations that are identified in equity emphasis areas, which are determined by the state VTrans as areas where there's a high number of vulnerable road users. So the question for this one is that the two thresholds that were developed is, would we want to focus on all segments where the population weighted potential for accessibility improvement is greater than 0? So again, anywhere where there's a potential for an accessibility improvement, do we want to include those as a potential location to receive the score? Or do we just want to focus on maybe the areas where there's a greater than average potential for accessibility improvement? So focus on the areas where there's a more acute or higher priority potential need.
I would say following this in the last couple of probably the larger stuff.
Okay.
So the first one.
Okay. For all of the measures. Okay. Anybody who wants to push back against that? Okay.
I mean, just back to Rory's point, at what point do you use all measures, does it start making some noise, does it make sense? I mean, that's the only reason why you start hearing things down, right? We don't, it's not, we don't live in a big in this. So it's taking that much data.
Yeah.
I mean, if it took the machine to run all night, I'm surprised. You know, probably more on the afternoon than us. Pretty much the number, so we just take it apart. Yeah, so I mean, the winnowing is based on that map right there. It looks like a lot of portions of. I mean, it's hard to see the scale, it's hard to see the city boundary and stuff like that, but. It looks like, you got a lot of need in the city. And then some of those country roads out in the. At least in the middle. So I don't know, I'm surprised that, like, for example, the northern part of the Rio GSD area can show up.
I think, well, this is Rio Road right here. So so Rio itself does show up as a high need, but this area right here.
Yeah, it's like comes up about Cape Cod, and then,
Well,
turns blue, which is, read this kind of in the color chart, but it needs a value of 201, so.
yeah. I don't think I'm not necessarily concerned about noise, but one of the things I will also mention is that if we're using the full set of the data, everything's going to receive a PAI score or a potential for accessibility improvement score, and that's okay. But everything's going to be scored. It's just a matter of, the places where there's this higher need identified through this accessibility improvement opportunity is going to be higher regardless of which of those thresholds we use.
Andy, can I make some comments? And I'm thinking out loud, so take these comments for you. I do want to share Michael's concern that looking at this map in particular, the coloring doesn't match up with what we've been discussing internally at the county for our prioritization process for pedestrian improvements. So that does make me question like where we're going with this particular measure. And then the other thing is, again, just thinking out loud, the whole scoring system seems like it favors a paradigm in which you're building up our major roadways to serve all those, but not thinking about, is that the best way to serve all of users? Like, there is another paradigm where you put pedestrians and bicyclists on parallel routes and you focus on building those up so that they feel the safest and most comfortable and are available to most users, and then you continue to push all of your vehicle traffic to major routes, but that doesn't seem to be considered at all.
So the first thing that I'll say is that I think to your first point, we also have to remember again that each of these measures is going to be cumulative against other measures. So I think I don't know this for sure, but I want you to hold that first thought, both of you. I want you to hold that first thought while we get into the land use score as well, because that could also add some additional context. And remember, we're going to be looking at the cumulative impact of all of these. So this is measuring accessibility to jobs, whereas the land use is also measuring accessibility to community destinations. So it could be that some of those concerns are being captured in a different measure. The second thing to your point is that I do agree with, I do understand that concern. I think part of that is we could certainly look at how this is weighted, but again, we're trying to identify needs right here, not necessarily develop solutions. So the solution could be, this isn't defining the solution. This is saying there's a problem or there's a need potentially that's identified for this area. And then we can go back and say, what makes sense as far as what solution? And that could be parallel roads, that could be trail systems, that could be something else. So,
It does come back to the factors undergird that, so it's sort of like Earlsville Road shows up a very high need. I guess it's because they're picking up the long bicycle stuff there. I mean, it's not for the job. I don't quite understand.
well, it's going back through, it's doing this exact same process for Earlysville Road. So it's looking at the population, it's looking at how many more jobs could somebody get to if they could access everything that's currently a level of traffic stress for it. So that could have to do with some of the developments up north on the northern corridor. I mean, we can look at this a little bit more, but it's using this exact same methodology for all of those. It's not based on the number of vehicles, it's based on the network that's in place right now and the number of jobs and the population.
Okay,
Yeah.
You know, part of this thing, it's how much data do you digest, make it meaningful, what do you pick as your variables? Are they return results and sort of make intuitive sense? I mean, that's kind of, this would help. And on the basis of what the logic of what they're trying to do makes kind of sense. I'm just kind of curious. It's interesting to see what this first cut of the data turns back. You look at that map and you're like, not trying to pick on Earlysville or Garth Road or where the other yellow line was way out there. But it's like, okay, so I'm thinking in my mind's eye, what jobs are out by the airport? On, what other Earlysville? And I'm wondering why that, as they do their math, why that ranks to high particular one. It's like any kind of data. You start looking at it, you start seeing outliers.
Sure, yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute, these outliers don't make sense. It starts making you question the whole underlying architecture. And that's where you're gonna have, you roll this out to the public, they're gonna be like, the heck? And you guys have experienced some of that with Mall in the city, right? A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, since the tracks, it's sort of square, so it could be.
That's kind of extreme.
Yeah. It's just track or block, whatever. These aren't square, so something like Earlysville Road be a weird.
Right.
Geographical. It's.
I don't bring that up to derail it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, we're gonna add these factors together. And side, one of the reasons that land use is being back and smart being taken out is because they had a lot of projects that if you didn't have a land use for, they wouldn't have gotten in on their congestion or safety scores, and they were slowly getting in on land use score. And I think VDOT looking at it sort of like you can't have land use solely what a transportation solution is. It doesn't meet the transportation goals. I think it can be a factor in it. I think it's recognized that. I'm just one of the example of a factor that's supposed to set, the constellation factor and get it put out through your results. You may think forms of that, but that's what it can talk about. So it seems like there's a potential. Anytime when you work with big data like this,
Yeah, and I
and
think
make
it's,
it make sense.
I like what you said about it's a factor and a constellation effect. In isolation,
It
we
may,
might be seeing some of these like red flags, but then when paired with all of the others, it might begin to say, actually, Earlsville Road is not a priority compared to this other road that has all of these other.
these
factors.
other factors, right? Anyhow.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. The other thing that we could potentially look at if we wanted to is to go back and think about this weighting and whether or not we agree with those assumptions. So the report says that the functional classification is used to scale the weighted average by the volume of trips, because they're assuming that basically the higher classified streets are more heavily utilized than lower classified streets. If we think it's actually the opposite, or that maybe the actual functional classification isn't likely necessarily going to mean that there's a likely higher utilization of these facilities or something like that, then we could change this weighting as well.
Yeah, so I guess, but the reason I don't buy that is because we're already like doing this based on like population and then where the jobs are, and so people will take the lowest stress route to get there, regardless of the street's classification. And so this weighting, I think, is the factor that makes that eliminates like the parallel route. I think because you're giving this multiplier to the roads that are kind of the worst for
Yeah.
for
So-
that.
So is that maybe a starting point, is that we don't use the functional just take the functional classification weighting out of
I
that?
think it'd be interesting to get to the end of where you're going and come back and take it apart.
Okay,
I mean. You know, again, really sweet if you guys would like provide some PowerPoint presentation, we can come in to the meeting, so we can like at least go through the thing and see where you're headed with it, and what kind of digest. I'm not digesting the slide at the same time, I'm trying to give you an intelligent response. I'm not doing a great job at giving you an intelligent response.
Well, I wonder too, yeah, sorry. I think that keep belaboring this. But if something like 0.9 more shows up as. For example, pollution is not a high priority. But if something were to show up as a principal arterial or showing up as a high priority. Solution, it doesn't have to be. Build a bike lane on that particular arterial. Solution could be to look at the local roads around it to improve those. That may be a way forward too. Once we identify the areas that are of concern.
yeah, so also keep in mind that we're really just talking about non-motorized right now. We haven't even looked at, so this is transit access to jobs. That's going to be a little bit smaller because transit doesn't go as far. The transit system isn't as expansive, so that's what. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So in terms of transit,
Yeah.
are you factoring in this new transit pilot that's happening with that, or is it just going to be based on this route?
Yeah, I don't think so. This is actually using data that is, what is it, like a pool funded data from the University of Minnesota. So I'm pretty confident that this is all historic and isn't necessarily considering any like recent
Is it only
adjustment.
cat services or is it coming, commuter services?
I don't think that this is factoring in John's commuter services right here. Yeah, because again, we're focusing on where the trips are originating, not necessarily whether the trips are ending, the destinations. So I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think all of John's services start outside of the MPO's area, with the exception maybe Crozet. Yeah. And then that would be automobile access. And then the disadvantaged population access is focusing on, it's doing the same thing, but it's just using transit service, because transit service would give the greatest opportunity for improved access to jobs comparatively, I think is the logic there. And so this is not weighting all of the population, but just the population within the disadvantaged areas. Yeah.
I just heard this data that this data is considering origin data, but not destination. So if we have an area that's like
exclusively residential, that's gonna, is that gonna come up with being more, like having a greater need? Whereas an area that is like just jobs is not gonna show up as having a high need?
It's going to show it's accessibility to jobs from residential areas. So the places where there are high needs are places where there is limited based on the residential population, the census population, and the number of jobs they can access and the opportunity to improve the number of jobs they can access.
Back, so like, the map here, the blue ones that are at the top, I think that one of those is Commonwealth Drive. I think that, you know, in that triangle, one of the triangles, Commonwealth Drive, a lot of disadvantaged communities along that stretch. So a lot of people live there, there are not enough jobs in the area. I guess we're saying they can get to those jobs fairly, it's low needs. They are relatively close to the jobs and they're near to them. Is that why that comes out low?
Yeah, it would come out low if this means that there aren't necessarily a lot of opportunities to improve the number of jobs they could get access if the conditions improved. And some of this could also change based on what we set at those like catchment areas. So, you know, we can define the catchment areas as well, whether we think that's a 30-minute commute or a 45-minute commute, or, you know, we can define that as well. So how we define those catchment areas could also potentially change what is highlighted as a need.
So it's one is transit access.
Mhm. I think the reason that this is based on transit access is because transit would provide the largest geographic opportunity to increase access to jobs. Yeah.
So we are pretty behind time here. Are we good to keep going on this? We need to get the tip amendment done. That should be pretty quick. Do we want to cut down on roundtable and go over smart scale, or so we can keep going on this, or do we want to try to wrap this up?
You did have 25 minutes scheduled for the roundtable.
I'm leaving the facts roundtable. This is interesting. I think this is the hard. This long-range transportation plan. It sounds to me like trying to about these needs identified on this qualitative aspect. This is at least half of the like RTPs. It's one of the major pillars. It supports it. So, yeah, I asked you to be. I've been asked to get into this for a long time. So I'm interested in talking this.
Okay. The other items might not take that potential for accessibility improvement took a long time to explain. I don't think the other ones will be that difficult. So I think what I'm hearing is that we want to use like the full, like all the needs for the potential for accessibility improvement for all the measures. And maybe once we start doing the analysis, we want to consider whether or not we want to keep that functional classification weighting in place. Is that correct? Okay. Any other comments or feedback on that?
At what point do you determine session? You said you can consider 30 or 45 or the distance for jobs.
Yeah, I think this is based on sort of commonly accepted or commonly assumed catchment areas, but I think we can also, again, maybe do our first pass at this and then, you know, do sort of a gut check. Where does the data make sense to us, and where does the data not make sense to us? And is that are our assumptions reasonable? Okay. So the next factor is related to the sort of the managing the roadway capacity, or so the congestion and the travel time reliability measure. So we're doing both a roadway measure using the travel time index and the planning time index, and then we also have a measure related to bus on-time performance, which we'll talk about in a second. The congestion mitigation needs, the recommended measure for these are the travel time index. So that is basically identify where there is like recurring congestion on roads. So where is like during the prime commute times, where what is the amount of additional time you need to take under congested conditions in order to reach your destination consistently. So that's measuring the recurrent condition. And then the travel time reliability is measured with the planning time index, which is basically measuring where are the most severe issues with system reliability. So if I want to be they use this 95 percentile travel time, which is basically saying if I want to be on time for work 95% of the time, how much of a buffer do I need to leave in my ongoing travel planning day? So the first one is measuring like just general congestion delays. The second one is measuring system reliability. So the two thresholds that they identified were either using a 1.3 index, meaning that there's a 30% increase either in the amount of time it takes under congested conditions compared to free flow conditions, or that there's a 30%, you need to leave yourself 30% additional extra time of your overall free flow commute time conditions in order to be at work at 95% of the time on time, or a higher threshold of 1.5. And again, it's the same question. The first one is going to say anywhere where there is an identified congestion or reliability concern would get picked up as a need, versus the second one saying like only the areas where there are the most significant needs are the ones that we want to consider for receiving a score in this area. And so these maps, I apologize, these are from VTrans, and I know that they're small and I know that they're dark, but the green lines right here represent the planning time index, and then the red lines are the congestion areas or the travel time index. And so this shows the difference between what would be considered a need under that lower 1.3 threshold for both of those factors versus the higher need, which is the 1.5 threshold.
So, we find to go towards a higher threshold here, but I also kind of feel like there should be like a time in minutes as well. So like on a 10-minute commute, if it bumps up to 15 minutes, like that's not nearly as catastrophic as a 40-minute commute going to an hour.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's a way for us to pull that out, but.
Well, and that also kind of depends on where you're starting and ending. So I don't know if that can be captured in this analysis or not. I can look into that.
I think there must be a way to like figure out, across that segment, what your average travel time is, and then across that segment, on the time delay. You probably, no matter where you're coming from, you hit the segment, you can get to it at it's taking 13. You're going, you can deal with the congestion. This community, you can deal with the congestion. They can politically be because of relative delay.
Right, yeah, exactly.
I would also worry about highest need.
The higher
Base because we don't really have congestion.
Yeah.
If we're going to focus on needs that we have, it's probably the one that we should be the most accepting of all projects.
Yeah.
But at this point, and you can't change it's fair. You will lose as well. In the city, right? And so it becomes, that's a bigger destination, which is density increases, the same could be. The city zoning ordinance does come to pass. You could have some congestion delays, and like, but we can't see that down, but we can project it as far as half.
Sure, and also we're talking about particular congestion.
Mm-hmm.
As we get denser and a lot more, but I care less and less. Except for the fact you can use your buses to that same congestion. That's the one point you do need the bus. Yeah. But I think we're measuring the buses.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't, there is bus delay travel time. Well, they're still late.
They are still linked. Maybe with those two together, though, the bus on-time performance might catch some of these areas where the buses are actually impacted by the roadway conditions. So the higher threshold for that one. Okay. So this is measuring the on-time. So the next one we'll talk about is the bus on-time performance. So this is really just measuring how well buses are performing with their on-time performance, and that's being considered. They're considered on time if they arrive no more than 30 seconds early and no more than 5 minutes late to major stops. So there are certain stops that have time points associated with them. We're measuring bus on-time performance based on where those time points are on the scheduled route. So there were two thresholds that were developed for this one. And again, I want to be really clear when I say this, that we're not using this to sort of make any inferences about the transit system operations or anything like that, but really to identify where there are system improvements, to your point, Michael, that are needed to help facilitate bus on-time performance. So the two thresholds that were used or suggested are either stops where the on-time performance for the bus system at those designated stops are less than the system average for the on-time performance from the previous year, or stops where the on-time performance is lower than the established transit performance goal. And I think talking to the transit agency, it might make sense to focus more on the system average, because that would help us understand where the system or where the transportation system or the bus system has the most opportunity to improve their performance based on like that would focus on probably their most critical needs. Do you want to add anything to that, Ben?
Yeah, the other thing. Their system measures on time performance is actually based on arrivals, not departures. So every bus that you see sitting in front of the downtown transit center is not on time because they got to the stop early. Even if they're going to sit there until their departure, they're still showing as not on time because they got there. So that's a flaw in that system. You don't want to carry that flaw into this analysis. So going with that less than 90%, that can be a problem for a lot of our themselves. And I'm sorry, they're showing up early, and that's an error. They're showing up. So downtown transit centers kind of stuff. So they have like 10, 15 minutes. Layover, use that. It's measuring whether they're on time based on the departure, but it's saying we got to the stop 10 minutes early. Instead of saying we left the stop on time, saying got to the stop 10 minutes early, so it's not that. I see. So every time you pull that downtown transit center up, sure, there's the big stop. I think church should call the stop pulling the direction, getting there and on time, we gotta get out of the bus. Right. Yeah, so that's a huge problem that Pat has that we don't get fixed for past TSP. But we don't want to carry that.
Yeah. Any questions or concerns with that?
What's that happen like?
This is the congestion map at the low threshold. That's the travel time reliability. So right here, it's just measuring. It looks like late, not early. I don't know, Ben, if that looks what you would expect it to.
Yeah, 5 and 7 also kind of problems. And how does this, interesting enough, I don't clearly have in my mind's eye where you guys are going to go with your regional transportation plan, but obviously that's how do you pick up that? There's some of the streets, hopefully adding word with the children on this. You're out of Fontaine, things like that. Isn't that in the that's in the formation plan of work regional transit plan, right?
Wait.
The transit vision plan. Yeah, this data set's coming from what's observable now from a system that's smaller than what you hope to be at in the next 10 years from now. At least certainly the time frame is planned.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with that?
Well, again, I think this is looking at the system performance, where the opportunities are for improvement, where the highest critical needs are based on what we're observing now. But then I also think that some of these observations you're talking about are things that we could also capture partially in the model if we think there are going to be capacity improvements in the regional transportation model. But I think a lot of this also speaks to helping us understand not just like what the needs are, but what types of improvements will be appropriate based on our future growth conditions and future transit system conditions.
So your travel time index, most couple slides, we may get back to it. It did show item 4 place and badly adjusted. Right? If you want to For the bus line, if you're really planned, how do you mention the verbs of that? I mean, how would it look like? Or maybe you can't get to that level of detail. I don't know.
I don't know that that is even going to would accurately be captured in the modeling process itself. I think the impacts from the transit improvements are really challenging to sort of capture. So I think part of this is just working to use our best professional judgment as we're implementing the solutions to assess what can we do and what do we think is going to have the most value for the community.
The map, you got some travel time delays, I'm just pulling this out of the air, as you can, I corridor. We don't want currently run bus lines down out of the corridor, but if we do want to run those down one day, we're gonna have to manually sort of figure out.
I think so, yeah. I mean, there are advancements in the travel modeling that's happening too, so maybe someday those could provide more like accuracy when it comes to integrating the improvements that could be anticipated from transit operations. All right, so the next set of measures that we're looking at is this access to non-work destinations. So this is really capturing the land use considerations. So before we were looking at improving access to jobs, and Jessica, you're just in time. So now we're talking about how do we improve access to non-work destinations, and this is using a set of data from VTrans referred to as there's a walk score, there's a bike score, there's a transit score. So all of these are sort of measuring what is the opportunity to improve what is the opportunity to improve access to all of these community destinations that aren't necessarily primarily considered jobs. So it includes things like, I think it includes schools, libraries, parks, grocery stores, places like that, like those kinds of community destinations where obviously people work as well, but have value to the community outside of being job centers. And then it's also based on analyzing the overall intersection density. So to find where there are opportunities basically for really non-motorized transportation alternatives that would improve the connectivity of these denser land use areas. So there were two thresholds that were recommended for this one as well. First of all, is that we could focus on areas where there are higher land use or these higher walk scores or transit scores that are in the defined growth areas. So this would basically be focusing on the total area of the city of Charlottesville and then the identified growth areas in Albemarle County. So focusing on any opportunity where there's a high. The other thing I should explain to this, because this is a little bit counterintuitive, is that locations where there is a higher walk score, which means that there's a higher network density, which means that there's a higher number of these community destinations that would be accessible, will score better. That's a little bit counterintuitive, but the idea is that those would be opportunities where it would just increase accessibility, where there might be like network gaps that could be filled that would improve the opportunity to better connect land uses within these areas. So the first one would focus on the development areas, and then the second segment would define basically anything that had a somewhat walkable census tract. So there's a walk score that's 50 or greater in any areas within the MPO. And so again, the effect of affecting the first threshold is that needs will be considered for all of the growth areas, regardless of the current walk score. So everything would be scored if it's within one of the growth areas. And then the result of the second one is that basically the walk scores would be higher in the more urban areas, even though the entire MPO region would potentially be eligible to receive a score. And then this is also measured by the total population and employment in the TAZs. So there is some consideration, to your point, Michael, for the future growth projections for each of these areas. So if you have a population that maybe doesn't have as high of a base population now, but you're anticipating it's going to grow significantly, that would get a little bit more of a higher weighting in the prioritization of that. So this is where you see some of those opportunities in that northern section of 29 show up a little bit more that maybe weren't captured as much with the job accessibility measures.
And You don't have to have a map of these activity centers, do you?
No, but this is all based on V-Trans data, so this is all data that's being pulled directly from V-Trans.
The reason I ask that is because sometimes I've seen V-Trans, it's a point. Pantops is represented by a point someplace, you know, over top of me, flow line motive. So I don't know how that works in the system, but I don't quite understand. It seemed to me the walk score, obviously, that comes from that measure that tries to show how walkability various sentence tracks are. But these people are trying to get to this is a measure of people who live not necessarily in one of those highly walkable areas, how to get to the walkable areas, but it's a measure of people who live in a walkable area to get to the activity centers.
It's within the it's within the walkability area. So it's just basically saying how walkable it is. And then it's weighted. This is recommending that there's a weighting by the population.
So in other words, this is the high figures here are areas that are relatively a lot of people that have a relatively reasonable capacity to walk. And that's what this is showing us.
So this is the walk area, and they also did this for non-work destinations for disadvantaged populations as well. Yeah.
And is there another one that does for bicycle stuff too?
I think we use the walk score because that seemed to capture sort of this land use coordination factor most comprehensively, because they also develop through V-Trans, they also develop a bike score and a transit score, but we focused on the walk score.
It's the walk score saying where the walking is good, right?
It's where the walking is good, but where the walk is good and there's opportunities for, so this kind of gets at this question, almost the walk score and the potential for accessibility improvement are almost measuring like two different sides of the accessibility argument. So the potential for accessibility improvement is saying we want to expand the breadth of where people can go. And then the walk score is saying, but we want to connect our dense areas really well. So it's kind of correct.
Which intuitively makes sense, you create some walkable areas with range perspective and build off of that. You're trying to create a vision so that you can't
It seems a little weird to phrase it as we have a walking need, it's where all the walking needs to do. Like seeing this map and saying this is where our needs are, it's where the bright yellow is. Or do we have that many walking needs in downtown Charlottesville? Because we think that's pretty small.
Yeah.
Right.
I was just curious, like, that Pantops, the far right.
Yeah.
Is that like a good example of kind of help me understand exactly what we're defining here? I mean, along 250, there's a lot of people, so the need is high.
There's a lot of people, there are a lot of restaurants, businesses, medical, like community facilities that people would need to access. And there's also a high network density. What there isn't necessarily good in Pantops is maybe the facilities, consistent facilities throughout the area. So this is saying like these are opportunities where there's already where there's like a really good opportunity to connect these dense areas.
It's capturing both those things. Yes. Okay.
But again, context matters. This is saying this is where there would be the most opportunity, but we would have to apply our professional judgment to say this is what it would take to improve that, or this is why this may or may not be a good candidate for a project.
So why is like this street, wagons on one side and the food line in the city on the other side, that doesn't seem to show up. I mean, of course, scale here, but it doesn't seem to show up on this thing. It's like a place that is, I guess it's not very walkable, but certainly a destination a lot of people really close by, I think to walk to. And so I don't, because this map was done by the need, but this particular map's not showing that need of people doing walking wagons who maybe you live in the big south, half a mile, but that's what's being shown by there.
But that might be shown by the accessibility measure, correct?
I'm hopping my soapbox for 1 second. I was very happy to see the county is moving in their comments plan and identify centers. You know, areas that are, and I think on the observations, they identified too many centers or too diverse or too dispersed, and they were having a hard time creating a conversation. City, I mean, you and I went over this thing, you know, there's certain areas in the city that are kids and people trying to get to it, but they can walk. There are centers, I think, trying to get to those centers. I'm not quite sure, maybe that would be another way, but I don't know what V-Trans again. I should probably go back and investigate my own sister agency's creation of needs there. But what if we use different polygons? As you know, a different proxy, because when we closer to the areas of the county, someone saying the city identified as these are the areas where we are trying to put, these are the activities certainly in front of us.
Yeah, I'm using, so I just want to clarify, because maybe this is a place where we're getting a little hung up. This is not actually using the defined V-Trans activity centers in this analysis. This is using a walk score that is developed by like a third-party agency that is being fed into this. So I'm using activity center, not necessarily as the same way V-Trans would use it, but basically saying as like places that would generate a location of interest for people to travel to. And if you go to V-Trans and you look at the walk score data, it will tell you what like factors it considers when developing the walk scores. Yeah.
So what are we seeing as methods outside of the development areas? It may be like a little bit of 29 between Hollywood and Pine Mountain.
Well, this is the development area, so you won't see anything else. But the idea would be like, do you want to consider the whole area, or do you want to focus basically on supporting this transportation land use coordination within the defined development areas?
Yeah, I mean, within the MPO around the development area, it would be maybe some IV stuff that was developed for development areas, maybe a crossroads community.
Mhm.
Can you go back to what the decision you're asking us about? All segments of somewhat walkable census tracts. What is somewhat give me a map of what somewhat walkable?
No, but it would be anywhere where there's a walk score that's greater than 50. So basically saying that 50 is sort of the cutoff for where we think that there might be some good intersection density and enough locations of interest that maybe could constitute being scored for this walk score.
And what you're showing in the map, it's scores scaled by population.
Yes.
But this is all.
Well, this is just the development areas.
Oh.
But I think the logic would be that probably the development areas would have the highest scores regardless.
Yeah, I think it's actually some places in the development areas that for just as your non-working destinations.
Mm-hmm.
So do all these, so do all of these have a score that's higher than 49 that we're seeing?
I will say that we're still working with the consultants to actually be able to run the analysis, so I don't have the raw data for this. So I'm not sure.
I would say go with the looser metric. There are a couple places outside the development area. Albemarle High School comes to mind, that might be important for this, that maybe should be in the development area, but aren't. And then, in PAC 44 process, they're talking about kind of a renewed priority on these crossroads communities, which maybe like Earlysville is in the MPO, that might also have value for kind of local areas that are in the rural area, but sort of usable nodes of walkability and usable services. So
Okay.
I would be surprised if there was much outside of either of those two that had any one sort of already. So
Do you, Albemarle County, do you have any thoughts? I feel like this impacts you guys maybe potentially the most.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of this specific question that you're asking us right now, I agree that we should go with the user definition.
Okay.
I do want to like broadly express concern, because looking at these tentative maps, we're not going, we haven't gone through the process yet, that's figuring out some questions, but just looking at the maps, it really doesn't make intuitive sense to me based on. And you guys just pointed out some good ones like Rio, especially Rio west of the J.D. Martinburg Way, hydraulic Rio loop, where we have the high school and middle school and like not seeing that light up on any of the maps is worrisome. Just broadly concerned, I think that the process is very independent pieces of data, driven by independent pieces of data that I'm looking forward to seeing how they all connect and what that means to the end, because independently, I'm not seeing it make sense.
Sure.
Which kind of comes back to, once we get a better idea of the course, then we can come back and talk about
Right.
decisions we made on these trees.
Yeah, again, these are not necessarily, these are not necessarily, these are meant to be like pointers, like to point us in the direction, not necessarily to say like, this is the only information that we need.
Which is kind of why.
Yeah.
It didn't, you thought, and you hear what Roy had said about that. To me, the development area is a very good measure of, obviously we try to do it everywhere. This is trying to like lit them out in that place, so highlight these areas we need to focus on. And arguably Albemarle High School is not show up in that, it's not close to the, it may be a destination, and you may deal with management. Or management, I think we can connect that with the feature, but these we seem to correspond in some respects to areas, you know, I see Rio and hydraulic kind of area when I'm not showing up. And probably an area that shows up in the stuff that Tori says, you know, a week or two ago about the centers and where they work. It doesn't show this region, which is kind of a bit, you know, and it's got handoffs, and it's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on in handoffs to scale. You know, that's when you want centers too, right?
That was like fisheries in the media. Looking closely, it's kind of hard to see with the color scale. Right. So maybe you can
This is the problem with using big data. And big data sets, we could use this. It is developed, big one across the state, which is helpful.
Yeah.
You can't like. Sort of pick out product, you need to have some, you need to have one, right? And then we get into this very finite area. And using a big data set. I think you can see what you're talking about. I'm probably not. Doing it. I think you're having to get. More than this thing, I think that the other component of this is the citizen survey, which. I mean, the data set we have for that. It's not as big as we'd like it to be, and who knows what's being. You know, community associations sort of like, hey, everybody get on it, you know, or yeah, I mean, it's just sort of just geographic distribution, how it's came from.
Yeah.
Because if somebody doesn't. Lives in underrepresented. Whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just want to reassure you all that, again, like, I certainly understand that there's limitations with the data. We are required to do a data-driven performance process, so this is a first step towards doing that. It gives us pieces of information, and there's going to be an opportunity for us to review this, to say this is what the data is not picking up that I know is a need. Maybe some of that is captured in the community feedback as well. So hopefully, you know, there are probably at least 3 prongs to sort of identifying the needs, and this is one of them. So, any other comments on that? I think that gets through the bulk of it. So this is a good place to sort of wrap up this conversation for right now. Rory, I'm sorry that we are so behind on time.
Yeah, is it possible we can like. Get some of these files and just put everything out on this board?
Yeah. I mean, all the information should be in the report that was sent out. I can send out the PowerPoint. Like I said, we're still working with the consultants to actually be able to process the information, be able to run the analysis. I don't have any raw numbers I can share. There you go.
One second.
Yeah.
I looked at the thing really quickly,
Mhm.
got the computers, without vacation last week, yeah, I haven't gone through it yet.
Yeah.
You looked at the same thing you provided us a couple months back.
Yes, yes.
But this is the first time I'm sort of seeing how that report starts to play out on the map. What's looking at the data, so.
Yeah, I can say, I'll be happy to send these maps out as well.
All right, so.
Yeah, there are sample maps.
Yes, correct.
Not the actual maps. Once
Yes, correct.
the threshold study.
Right, we just picked a bunch of thresholds right there.
Yeah,
Yes.
and these are just samples of like what the output might look like. Am I misinterpreting that?
No,
So, wait, what do you mean, like, that's with a particular threshold that might not be the one we picked, or those are?
yeah, I mean, we need to like verify the data sources that were used. We need to, those were like thresholds that, like, these were just intended to sort of be examples of what the outputs would look like. This also doesn't show the cumulative like system needs.
Right,
Yeah,
okay. All right, I guess let's move on, to the TIP amendment,
Yeah.
I guess go relatively quickly on that one, yeah.
yeah, so the TIP amendment is really just that the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority determined that they were able to use money through the congestion mitigation and air quality program that did not go where I thought it was going to go, to support new state services for Amtrak. So they would like to program a portion of CMAQ funding to the Charlottesville Albemarle area to cover a portion of the expenses for Roanoke Route 46 that would be going through the Charlottesville Albemarle region using CMAQ funding. So this does require a TIP amendment because it is in the amount of $9 million, a little over $9 million, but basically it's new CMAQ funding for that particular service. So we would just need a recommendation to the policy board.
Do you hear a motion? Second. Motion is second, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Same. One abstention, passing unanimously, one abstention. All right, that was quick, good job, guys. All right, do we want to go on to smart scale, or are we gonna mix some stuff today?
No, we can have just a really quick conversation on smart scale. Mostly there are just a couple of things that I wanted to show you all. So based on the proposed change to how the land use score was applied, what I did was I went through and looked at all of the round 5 scores in the MPO area that were submitted in round 5, and this shows sort of what the impacts on the scoring outcomes would be. As Michael had mentioned earlier, the Avon Street multimodal improvement project was one that got a vast majority of its score from the land use score. I think it had a total benefit score of 13.4, and 12.6 of those points came from the land use score. So when you make the adjustment to convert the land use from a standalone score to a multiplier, this just shows what the outcomes are. Now, overall, the expectation is that the project scores would be lower in general. And so it's not necessarily a major concern that some of these are experiencing small decreases in the project score, because remember, smart scale brings projects against other projects, but you can see that in some cases it would significantly impact the likelihood that those types of projects would be funded. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of additional context for that. And then the other thing that I did was I went back and looked at all of the projects that were submitted within our region on rounds 1 through 5. And pulled out the projects that the MPO would be eligible to submit based on the changes to the high priority program definition that is being proposed. So what I will say that is good for our region is that the MPO is submitting the right types of projects by and large. Like, these were the projects that appear to meet that definition. I wasn't 100% sure on these 2 projects at the bottom. The exit 118 was sort of entered into smart scale as a safety improvement to correct some weaving patterns that had impacts on the interchange, but wasn't necessarily indicated as an interchange improvement project. So I'm not sure if that one would meet that definition. And then I think we're still unsure on whether or not the Urbana River bicycle and pedestrian crossing would be considered a new capacity highway project or not. I know that one's a little bit of an outlier. But what this does mean is that there were a number of other projects that the MPO also submitted that they would not have been able to submit based on this list. And I looked at all the projects for the city of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, TJPDC, and the MPO submitted. So these were the list of projects that we would have continued to have been able to submit under that. So just wanted to provide a little bit of additional context as part of that discussion and give you all an opportunity if there's any other feedback you want to share or pass on to the policy board related to the proposed changes in the smart scale program.
Pretty bad.
Anything you want me to go back to?
I will just say, in one call, they have the district planner, we talk about adding, regional trails to this. We try to hear what that definition, working with definition, what that definition would be. So,
Okay.
To that, to the projects that could be submitted by like MPO.
right, but remember, kind of like the basic underlying logic. The locality is still a lot of project, right?
Right.
But I think the intent here is to try and, focus on these systemic issues that are building water, range, and impact regional transportation, especially integrated movements on board with the state lines getting into the movement. But the idea of opening it up to a regional trails is being considered, given that might be it. I think that's, I interpret the biggest part of our room in this community is not being one multi-million project through their but maybe you have a regional bike plan that's on that, maybe we let that push in front here. I don't know if it has, in other words, I don't know if they're just funding things like 3-notch trail exclusively. Or even it's not something you have in the state that we've built right now, what we're talking about. So there's more between jurisdictions and commuter pattern. Is there any more discussion about the past performance?
No, not that I'm aware of. They aren't talking about this in August. I think they're next expected to bring this up again in September. I think some of the things I might have heard, and again, Michael, if you've heard anything from your side of things, certainly feel free to jump in. I think one of the things isn't necessarily it might not necessarily be about like not awarding projects based on past performance, but maybe reconsidering the request to administer for past performance. So maybe if there's been a performance concern previously, you just wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to locally administer a project in order to qualify for funds.
Seems fine.
Yeah. I don't know if that's consistent with what you're hearing, but that's some of the other discussions that might be part of it. That's not official CTP like policy though.
Well, that's a problem, regardless. We all like, try to improve on time, on budget, projects.
Yeah.
That may back, it was certainly something that's not considered in smart scale fees. And I think with the recognition as part of the state trying to, and by the state, I mean the state to the county, it's trying to roll out transportation plan and spend money. You have a problematic program, and why would you get your money on it? I think it's a fair question. That is.
Any other feedback you all want to capture for consideration by the policy board? You're also welcome to email me this afternoon if there's anything else you think of. Can we get those slides? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on this one, I think, if we can send a message that it does make sense to not let the locality administer, but that the needs are no less real. Charles is just gonna be cut out of smart scale for the next decade, that's gonna be a problem, but, and it doesn't seem, you know, reasonable. But if Charles is looking at industry projects, you know, that seems more reasonable.
Not overrating projects, but it's all about.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and if we're gonna need more jurisdictions to this in the future, probably good for you not to do guys on how you get out of that. Which they do. I mean, you also working on this same force plan, right? And so, there are different levels. They may go into the worst level, and work their way back out.
any other thoughts or comments?
I guess the last thing we're gonna say. Yeah, and it's talk about if VDOT does have to use the city projects, how does that affect lots of potential conflicts, business styles. If VDOT turns over the city projects, well, the dynamics of, to figure out, if that's where it happens, we have our standards and these items. We would need more some of the VDOT in that situation as well as actually what to do. I have less worried by, I mean, maybe less afraid of stuff, because I'm saying anything else. Goes into the project. Turn around.
Standing,
Yeah.
Going back to that, you know, taking the land use factor out. It seemed to really degrade our school on a lot of projects on the previous round. You sense there, I think it's statewide, you know, everybody would be dealing with similar difference, or would necessarily lose out on all those projects, or it's just like
Yeah,
hurting us more than for like.
the biggest impacts by far on this, based on the analysis that that the OIP staff did and looking at what the impacts are going to be. I don't think it's necessarily going to hurt us more than it hurts other regions, but it will have the biggest impact on small bicycle and pedestrian projects, which get a majority of their points from land use.
So, I mean, that seems to like indicate a deficiency in the scoring for all the other like metrics to me. You know, like Avon Street multimodal, you know, there essentially are no bike and ped facilities there now. You know, I feel like there should be some like congestion mitigation score that we get from that, because people will take trips outside the car now. But it's not very much.
So, I mean, everything's relative, right? So, you know, it's adjustments worth being made in the
Yeah, so there weren't, the other thing that I've heard a lot of people talking about is really how safety is measured. So for example, I'll use a different project because I just know this off the top of my head, but for the Ravenna River Bicycle and Pedestrian Bridge, it actually didn't get any points for safety improvements because there's not a facility currently there that, you know, they're seeing any sort of incidences on. So there are some of those kinds of challenges with some of these projects where maybe that intuitively it feels like there are some improvements related to safety or congestion that aren't necessarily captured in how they're measuring the project benefits.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
So, there's no facility currently there that is showing change or showing problems. So the free bridge is not. And if it was, would like, how would that be captured if there was incidents like on there? Like how does that data collected?
Oh gosh. I mean, it's pretty similar to what we were talking about with the long range transportation plan, where there's like a basis on a crash history or a potential for safety improvement or something like that. So if there's an incident or if there's an area where you can measure that there's some sort of like negative impact that the project would resolve, you would get a score for that. I don't know the specific measures. We could look at the technical guide.
The bridge is too far out of the area be considered.
Yeah, and again, I guess, to be fair, they're doing this they have to develop a system that is going to be applied for almost 400 projects throughout the state every year. So they can't take these, they can only be so context sensitive in these, but yeah.
I will say,
I was just curious.
Yeah.
Upwards that project ship, I can't remember. Get a lot of points, we got them, probably, but it wasn't, your other bike runs, I got the same relative amount of points. Because you didn't have that base data to justify like it was already happening there. Suggestion, the counter, what, of course, only activity on that trail, I'm on the day enough, people walking the dogs and doing more recreation activities that maybe transportation, get into.
Maybe, I believe-
But it's the same, it's a big system.
Yeah. But I think to your point, Rory, that there are benefits that probably feel intuitive that aren't being captured. So I think maybe that is one argument that I've heard other people making for why the land use score is valuable. Sure. Sure.
I guess, to that point, it's either the land use score is kind of a proxy for that, that idea of like, you can't measure how many people want to cross a river by how many people are swimming across right now before you have a bridge. Clearly, I think there be at least like Avon, having bike path facilities at Avon, they're going to be more widely used for transportation, probably even than a bridge and docks. But because we happen to have a trail nearby, that happens to score well. But it's because of the land use on Avon that we know that bike path facilities would be heavily used. But if there's no way to capture that, to me that's what the land use score is there for, right? And so if we're getting rid of it, there should be some other way to proxy that, you would think. But
so it sounds like what you're saying is that land use maybe is a proxy for measuring some of the latent demand or the latent need.
exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe they can find another metric to replace it with.
Of course, we'll want to start with the background on the policy. Yeah, and very down about, but certainly land use is large and good. There's two factors in land use and development, consistent development that's going on. When you get more for a project that is a site plan under construction, or getting ready to do the construction than you do for one that's finished. It is, so you almost have to time it. I hear other people in the county of like, oh yeah, we got a big data centers coming there, so this is what we're gonna put our next. Smart scale, we're trying to be able to grab the land next door.
Yeah.
In this area, you have so much room in downtown mall, you have a property, there's a project someplace closer to the downtown mall. You get a lot of things to it. There's just so much happening in the downtown mall, there's huge projects.
Yeah,
That have a little bit of commercial in it, and then a lot of residential, count all residential square footage, and they had no commercial in it, we wouldn't be able to count. There's a lot of these really very finite rules that sort of don't seem to sort of come back to the development area or the boundary concept. It's kind of unique and sticky, right? There's nobody else in the state that has developed a boundary around that. You have to be allowed now, sure.
There are principally in as the urban, the rural.
And I guess Virginia Beach does too and stuff,
But I mean, to that point, it should be more about like the density of what's there than, oh, there happens to be like economic activity happening or development happening now. In potentially a place that isn't very dense. And maybe that's how you replace it with something that's a better measure of latent demand, because the downtown mall was plenty dense, 20 years ago, before there was much development activity happening around, maybe. And there was still just as much latent demand, maybe. But yeah, it doesn't make a ton of sense, I guess, for projects under development to be the big pattern.
Yeah, sure. All right, I think That's probably, if you all have any other thoughts, you're welcome to email me this afternoon as well, but it is 11:59, so that'd be.
Yep, does anyone have any roundtable updates? They're just dying to get out.
Want to make sure that all of them go to their session.
Nice. Very cool. Looking forward to checking it out when I'm done, but probably they're not even months out. Sorry.
Quick reminder to go back in a few minutes.
Oh, right, yes, we need to approve the July 18 minutes, we have a motion. All right, motion,
Sorry, there was a correction word. I don't know if this is. In Alberta's comments, he said that we're going to RFP process. He just said that. I just want to verify for everyone who's going to RFP before the national.
okay, so one correction, RFP to RFP, with a motion to approve, is that, you have a second? Have a second, all in favor, say aye. Aye, any opposed? Any exceptions? All right, great, approved unanimously. Anyone else, roundtable updates, they really want to get out? We have a consolidated draft zoning ordinance in the city, check it out. All right, that, any closing matters from the public? Oh, Tiffany?
I'll make it quick because I know everyone wants to probably get to lunch, but I will send our agency update. Just noted that we had our post-award webinar last Friday. The recording and the presentations are available on the website. And then we are also going to be rolling out our new assignments for MPOs. So Daniel Wagner has been sitting on this call, patiently listening to the discussion, but he will be assuming as your main point of contact. But as always, if there are any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me or anyone else. But everything else I'll send to the staff and they'll send it out with meeting minutes.
Great, thanks. All right, anything else for anyone? Do I have a motion to adjourn? All right, all in favor? Aye, that's unanimously. All right, thank you all.